Chapter 6, the Muscular System, Screencast 1. Now, this first screencast is actually going to serve as an overall introduction to muscle in general. Remember back to Chapter 4, where we introduced muscle as a primary tissue type, and the three subdivisions are skeletal muscle. Remember, skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. It's what attaches to skeleton, and it's responsible for mobility and strength. Cardiac muscle, as we saw in Chapter 8, is exclusively found within the heart. And then we have smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is found in the wall of whole hollow organs. So the digestive tract, blood vessels, ureters, the uterus, all of those are going to be examples of smooth muscle. Now, cardiac and smooth muscle are both involuntary. We have no physical control over those, yet we do have control over skeletal muscle, so we consider that to be voluntary. Now, muscle tissue is found everywhere, so we can expect to find it in all the organs of the body, and we can also remember that a big part of what muscle is doing is participating in any activity that requires movement. Now, if we look at how much muscle we can expect to find in someone, it's going to account for about 30% of total body weight in females and about 40% of total body weight in males. So we can actually see that there's a fairly significant difference in how much muscle we expect to find in males versus females. Now, the primary role that muscle is going to do is the production of movement. We introduced previously an example of voluntary, so that is something that we have conscious control over. So walking, anything like that that we control can be considered to be under that role. Involuntary, now we're looking at unconscious control over movement. Examples are going to be the beating of our heart, probably the best example that we can have. Now, many muscles resist movement. Examples of those are going to be how we maintain posture and also how we maintain blood pressure. Now, another role that muscle is going to play is within thermogenesis, and muscle is going to generate heat. Now, a way or another term that we can use to describe muscle is that it is excitable. So muscle will respond in response to electrical or chemical stimuli, and that response is going to be to contract. Now, that is something that all muscle cells have in common, regardless of the type. They work by shortening or contracting. When they relax, they will lengthen. Here is a diagram giving you an idea of how much muscle there is within the body. I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of these. We're just going to take a look at it as an overall example. So there's a lot. And if we look at skeletal muscle, there are approximately 600 skeletal muscles within the body. Now, we're going to be introducing a number of new terms, and I think it's important that we understand what these terms are. One term is synergistic. These are muscles that work together to create the same movement. Antagonistic muscles are muscles that oppose each other. Now, we're also going to be looking at tendons. This was introduced previously when we talked about connective tissue. Tendons connect muscle to bone. It's how muscles transmit their force to the skeleton. And a really good example is the Achilles tendon. Now, some terms that we're going to look at next are origin. That is the end of the muscle that attaches to a relatively stationary bone. The insertion, that is the end of muscle that's attached to another bone across a joint. This is where the contractile force is going to be focused on. So action is going to pull the insertion towards the origin. So let's take a look at this in a diagram, and we can see this here. So let's first look at this muscle. This is the biceps brachii, and look at where it's originating from. So we can see that it's originating from here, and it's inserting on another bone. Okay, that's important. So we're looking at an insertion on the radius, which is one of the bones that make up the two-arm complex of the forearm. Back here, we see the triceps, and notice where the triceps is actually inserting. So it also is crossing a joint, and it's inserting on the ulna, which is the other bone that makes up the forearm complex. So here we can see a really good example of origin versus insertion. Now, here is another example of the terms antagonistic. So here we see the biceps actually contracting, and notice what's happening to the forearm. It's approaching, okay, or getting closer to the origin. Here, the tricep has to actually relax to allow the biceps to contract. Here, we're going to see the reverse. So as the triceps is contracting, the bicep must relax to allow that movement of extension to take place. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is take a look at the general makeup of muscle. And I'm actually going to go a little backwards from this particular slide, and I'm going to work from smallest to largest. So one of the terms you're going to hear me use is muscle fiber. You can interchange the term fiber and cell. So you'll hear me do that repeatedly. Characteristics of muscle fibers are they are long and tube-shaped. They can also vary in length. They can be very, very short, or they can be relatively long. Now, a muscle fiber will run the entire length of a whole muscle. We'll get back to that. Now, another characteristic of a muscle fiber is that it's multinucleate. Now, we're also going to see what makes up a muscle fiber. So muscle fibers are actually made up of myofibrils, and these are long cylindrical structures that contain our contractile proteins, actin and myosin. Now, a fascicle, that is actually a bundle of muscle fibers, and these are actually wrapped with connective tissue. Then we're going to see a whole muscle, and that's going to be fascicles that are bundled together with connective tissue. And what we're going to see here, those muscles are a group of muscle cells that share the same origin, insertion, and function. Now, kind of imagine I'm going to use spaghetti and saran wrap as an example. That one piece of spaghetti we can actually think of as a muscle fiber or muscle cell. That is going to be wrapped around with connective tissue. Then we're going to take a whole bunch of those pieces of spaghetti and we're going to wrap them together to form a fascicle. And then we're going to wrap those fascicles together with more saran wrap, and that's actually how we see a whole muscle. Okay, so I think that's important to have a general idea how this takes place. Now here we can actually see a muscle cell or muscle fiber. One of the characteristics we're going to see, remember, skeletal muscle is striated. We see multiple nuclei. Now we're actually seeing the myofibrils, and those are what actually make up muscle fibers or muscle cells. So that's going to be important for us to remember. Okay, so a single muscle cell is going to be made up of many individual myofibrils, and each one of those muscle cells will have multiple nuclei. One of the things that we kind of want to remember here is these myofibrils are going to be really important, and remember, they're responsible for actually making up the muscle cell itself.